Hello everybody, it's Gary Mrzinski and I'm back for the second half of Chapter 2. We left off with a discussion of capital, reminding you that when we use the term capital in an economics class, in fact for the remainder of this class, except for right now, we're going to always mean physical capital. We mean the facilities, the major fixed equipment, including computer systems and other technology that businesses use to produce their product. That's what we mean by capital. But there's also human capital. Human capital is the accumulation of knowledge from education and training and skills that accumulate through experience in a certain job. And these are possessed by an individual. This is capital that's attached to an individual person. Businesses want to invest in the human capital that their labor forces represent also. Here's an example of how our human capital has improved. So labor is one of the four factors of production. Do you recall when we discussed this in Chapter 1, I said the various factors of production can vary in quality from economy to economy. You would want to have a high-quality labor force, and I explained what that means. Well, in short, a high-quality labor force is a labor force where the workers possess a high level of human capital. You would want for that to be improving over time. Well, here's some numbers that show how it has improved in our economy. Since 1940, 5% of our labor force were college graduates. 40% are today. Now that seems low even today, but that is an improvement. And how about this? 30% of our labor force in 1940 were college graduates. 85% are today, and that 85% seems low to me. Here's a number I want you to remember because I'm going to ask you about it later in this course. Back to physical capital. Physical capital, again, is the facilities, the major fixed equipment and automation and technology, including computers and networks, that businesses own and organizations own to produce their product. That is their physical capital. If you add up the value of all of the physical capital across our whole economy that all of these businesses and other organizations own, this is just someone's estimate, $80 trillion. So remember what our GDP is. That's the total amount we produce, kind of like the total income of the U.S. economy. That's around 20 trillion. So it's about 4 times our annual level of production or our annual level of income in our economy. That seems about right, because think of an individual person. What would be the capital that an individual personally owns? Well, you would think of your house, right? And any other property that you own, but primarily the house. And what kind of house would you say someone could afford? Well, it's directly related to their income, right? So suppose someone makes, say, $50,000. It seems about reasonable that the person might live in a $150,000 home to $200,000 home, maybe that they're making payments on, but still that would be the capital they would use to produce their personal lives, more or less. So this seems about reasonable. 80 trillion in capital that our economy uses to produce products, and we produce 20 trillion in products every year. This makes us a high productivity economy. That's high compared to other economies. We have a lot of physical capital per worker. And that means we tend to produce, or we have a competitive advantage in capital intensive industries. Those are the kinds of jobs that have stayed here. Jobs that are not capital intensive, that are more labor intensive, are the kinds of jobs that have left our economy. Those are what are known as low productivity jobs. So what does this mean by high productivity versus low productivity jobs? Well, every business, every company measures this, and it's pretty easy. You look at what your annual revenue is as a business, divide that by the number of employees you have. That is production per person, productivity. Across our economy, you can do the same thing, right? That's GDP per capita. Well, in any given industry, the higher the level of capital, or the higher the value of capital, the higher the value of capital each worker has to work with, the more productive that worker should be. And again, that's true across the whole economy. Why would a business upgrade their technology? If they're, every business just about uses technology to produce their product. Why would you want to invest in upgrading or improving your technology? Because that makes each worker more productive. Same thing across the whole economy. So what kinds of jobs have left our economy? What kinds of jobs have remained in our economy? And this, as I said, capital-intensive jobs or capital-intensive industries, those jobs have remained. And labor-intensive, where capital is not as important, have left our economy. And examples of that are clothing manufacturing. My grandmother on my father's side, that industry is gone. Those jobs don't exist for the most part in our economy because that is low productivity work. And other economies that have lower labor rates have a competitive advantage in doing labor-intensive work. And those are the economies that have then received those kinds of jobs and expanded in those kinds of industries. Here's an example of, I mentioned a moment ago, how mechanized farm equipment has led to a drastic reduction in the number of workers in our agricultural labor force. That's because each worker has become more productive because the capital they have to use to produce agricultural goods has improved so much in the last 100 years. So here's an example on the right. That's a picture of a farmer in the United States. Mechanized farm equipment replacing the ox, pulling a plow, and use of fertilizer and pesticides, use of automated irrigation systems, computerized systems. These are all the types of capital that the American farmer has to work with, whereas in other poorer nations that can't afford the capital, they're going to be much less productive per worker in the population. Now, technology advances all the time. As this happens, that makes each worker more productive. This happens unevenly over time. But we had a period of accelerated technological advancement for the kinds of work we're still doing in our economy in the 1990s. You know that that's when the internet rose to great, the beginning of its use, really, and the use of big improvements in the computer industry due to the microchip. So advancements in the microchip, more and more computing power on a smaller and smaller device. A microchip is, the heart of electronics. So anything that's any kind of mobile device that you're holding has microchips in it that do processing. The power of that processing has improved significantly and accelerated beginning in the mid-1990s. So any industry that makes use of computers to produce their product, and just about everyone does, should have seen gains in productivity. And they did. And that led to one of the major drivers of the great economy we had in the 1990s, the second half of the 1990s. And then we eventually had a recession in the early 2000s, and then a bigger recession in the late 2000s. But that was the last period of great prosperity, and it was driven by the microchip. Here's some other factors that lead to economic growth. Factor mobility. This is, what are the factors? Labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and land. Well, land's not going to be mobile, but the others can be. Allocative efficiency. There are two types of efficiency that are important in macroeconomics and microeconomics. Allocative efficiency and productive efficiency. Productive efficiency is when you have competitive markets in your economy, and that makes each producer want to try to produce at the lowest possible per unit cost, which forces them to investigate new ways to produce, better ways to produce, lowering per unit costs, finding new technology to help them increase productivity, so maybe you need fewer workers to produce the same amount of units. There is pressure to do that in our type of system. That's productive efficiency. Allocative efficiency, on the other hand, has to do with, and this is a feature of the market system economy, if a given product is desired by consumers and demand is growing, that will drive up the market price. That will make businesses that produce that product more profitable. They're going to want to expand. And other businesses are going to want to stop producing what they're producing and produce this instead. So the factors of production will flow to this new hot market for products that people want. The market system economy facilitates that. Other kinds of economies, the command system economy, communism, government directive does not do that. But the market mechanism, the market system economy, facilitates allocative efficiency. The factors flow. Just think about the labor, how the labor would flow into an industry or a product market that people want more and more of. If people want more and more of it, then employers need more workers. They're going to be offering above average wages for those kinds of workers. People are going to leave their current jobs, no matter where they are, and especially if it's related, and they're going to go to where the higher paying jobs are. This is allocative efficiency. This is markets, in this case labor markets, facilitating the flow of factors into the producing the goods and services that society most desires. That is allocative efficiency. To the extent that that is happening in your economy, you are achieving allocative efficiency. Now let's think about globally. Look outside of our economy. Outsourcing and trade. Global trade has increased so much in the last just 20 years. It's amazing. And that's because economies are specializing in producing those goods and services that they have a competitive advantage in producing. So it has to do with opportunity cost. In the U.S., we have a comparative advantage in high-skill, capital-intensive jobs because we have a highly skilled workforce and we have higher value capital per worker than other economies. Workers in other countries that have lower labor rates, that's their competitive advantage. So they tend to get the kinds of jobs that are more labor intensive and less capital intensive. As I said, furniture, clothing. Some jobs come into our economy too. They don't just leave, and that's what this third bullet is making the point of saying. And it's not just manufacturing jobs that have left our economy. Even service jobs and highly professional jobs like engineering and accounting, some of those jobs have even left our economy, but the lower level engineering work and the lower level accounting work. So what is the role of government? With the market system economy, if you believe in it, you believe that private industry should be producing the goods and services, most of them. So privately owned companies. And it's the incentive to earn profit that then makes private owners want to invest in their companies, right? If that's what you believe. Well, let's start talking about, even in the market system economy, there is a role for government. What would it be? At the very minimum, you need for the government to provide a legal framework for the economy to be able to rely on. So this means a system of courts, a system of law enforcement that's not corrupt, so that people's property rights can be protected, so that one business can't steal from another business, and maybe it's like a supplier supplying, via a contract, supplying components or parts or raw materials to another business, and then maybe collects payment but doesn't deliver the goods. Well, you need to have some sort of recourse to rectify that. You need to have a system of courts. You need to have a system of law to protect personal property rights. Protecting the environment. If so much is being produced by private companies, and the concern there would be who's looking out for society, well, one of the things, if you don't have the government doing this, is your environment is going to suffer. This is something, by the way, that China has dealt with. China has not had the same environmental laws that we have had, and they're very hesitant to enact more stringent environmental laws, because that will slow down growth. We saw that they've been growing by 10% per year in GDP. This will slow down their growth because it's more expensive for businesses to produce if they need to be concerned about disposing of their waste in a responsible way, especially hazardous waste, and if they need to be concerned about limiting the air pollution that they generate and any other kind of environmental impact. If you have more stringent environmental laws, it's more expensive for them to produce. Now, if you have those laws, you think that that's the way to go. You should be doing that because you want to have a clean environment. That's part of quality of life too, right? Well, this is something that they've just recently started to be concerned about and starting to increase in China, their environmental regulation, because it's really become a problem, especially in their major industrial centers, the air pollution. You can see it. So what else do we need the government to do, even in the most market system economy? You want for there to be competition in product markets, and this is something that naturally happens, but you need for the government to step in if it's not happening. And sometimes a market power will become concentrated, maybe through mergers within a given industry. One of the large suppliers, producers, acquiring its competitors, making it a larger producer with larger market share, with more market power that it could abuse. Well, you need to have laws in place to make sure that there's no abuse of market power. And the government will even step in if there's a merger between two producers in a given market that have significant market share already, and this would give them maybe not necessarily monopoly power, but a lot of market power. Sometimes the government, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice will actually step in and prevent that from happening. The government also has laws to protect workplace safety. You've probably heard of OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. There are OSHA laws that protect workers that employers must abide by. There's this big group of laws called FLSA. You may have seen this sometimes even on your, I know I've had jobs. My very first job, my pay stub had a box that, two boxes with one or the other would be checked. Exempt or not exempt. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. This is when I was 22 years old. It meant exempt from FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act has all kinds of protections for hourly workers that make below some certain salary. And it's I think it's close to 30,000. So it's fairly low, the salary of the workers that this protects. But employers must provide to them overtime for any hours worked over 40 hours a week, generally speaking. So if you are exempt from these laws, you're probably in a professional job. I was an engineer at the time, so I was exempt. My employer did not have to pay me overtime. But hourly workers, I was salaried. I was a salaried employee. Hourly workers had to be paid overtime. Child labor laws are in there. For most jobs, you need to be 16. There's some exceptions to that. The minimum wage is bundled into FLSA, and these laws get revised all the time. So that part of the Fair Labor Standards Act gets revised whenever the government believes that the minimum wage should be raised. So the government has these kinds of employment laws. We talked about the various roles the government plays in supporting the economy, but the government is actually part of the production system too. The government produces goods and services. Think about what your government does for you, for your tax dollars. What do they produce? Well, they produce military services. The whole military budget is part of the federal government budget, and they are producing a service, defense services. K through 12 education is produced by the government, or at least funded by the government. So we'll talk more about this in Chapter 5, but a certain percentage of our GDP are goods and services that are produced by or funded by the government. And this is all governments, federal government, state government, local governments. It's about 1/4 of GDP. Now, it's actually a little bit less than that. We'll talk about that, as I said, in Chapter 5, and we'll look at how GDP breaks down into different categories. But in chapter 2 in your textbook, it says about 1/4 of GDP is allocated via the government, so that's what we're going with here. Now let's talk about income distribution. The issue here is how evenly distributed is the income across the population or across the workforce, the people that are earning the income. Well, the rule of thumb is the more well-developed the economy, usually the more evenly distributed the income is. And the less well-developed the economy is, in other words, the poorer the country is, the less productive the country is, the worse the income distribution is. So a bad income distribution would be if a real lot of the total income is concentrated among the top few percent of the people. That would be uneven income distribution. You want it to be spread out across the workforce, across the labor force. So you're going to see some data on the next slide in a second, but just sort of set up that discussion. The way this is done, the way this table is constructed on the next slide is the population is divided by, or actually the labor force, income earners are divided by quintile. So what this means is if you line everybody up in order of their income, then the top 20% of the people by head count are the top quintile. And then the next 20% of the people in order are the second quintile. And you'll see what income ranges the people in the different quintiles are making. But here's some overall measures. The top quintile in the U.S. gets half of all U.S. income. They're earning 50% of all income. The bottom quintile gets about 3%. The richest 10th percent of the U.S. families get 30% of U.S. total income. Now, we have been criticized, the U.S. economy, for having less well-distributed income than other economies that are similar to us, like in Europe or Japan. So what that means is income is a little bit more concentrated among the top few percent of our citizens. So here are the quintiles. The highest fifth, again, you've got everybody lined up in order of their income. The top 20% of the people are earning 51% of total income. Half of all total income is being earned by the top fifth. The next fifth earns 23%. The middle fifth earns 14%, and the bottom fifth earns only 3%. Now, as I said, it's never going to be, if you're looking at the table and you look at that column to the far right, that's the percent of total income earned by each of the quintiles. It's never going to be 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%. That could only happen if everybody earned the same income. Well, that's never going to happen, and that shouldn't happen. But this is considered more uneven. It would be preferable, for example, if the highest fifth made 25% of total income, and the second fifth made, 22% or something like that. Something that's different from the numbers you see and closer to 20%, but not as far off as these are. As I mentioned, the poorer the country, the less well-distributed the income is, the less evenly distributed it is, the more concentrated income is. It's a smaller amount of income, but it's concentrated among the top few percent. Now, you're never going to have perfectly evenly distributed income. I mean, that just wouldn't work. That would mean that everybody makes the same salary in a year. And so that means that the brain surgeon makes the same amount of money as the janitor. Well, nobody would want to be a brain surgeon and spend all those years in medical school. The president of a company would make the same salary as entry-level workers. Well, nobody would want to be the president and have all that responsibility. So, I mean, you're never going to have perfectly evenly distributed income. But still, you don't want it to be really concentrated. And comparing ourselves to a poor country, South Africa, the richest 10th or 10% of South African families get 51% of total income. In the United States, it's 30%, if you recall from a few slides ago. So the richest 10% of Americans make 30% of total income. Well, it's 51% in South Africa. This graphic further illustrates how the poorer the nation is, the less evenly distributed the income is, and the more concentrated the income is among the top few percent of the income earners. So all the way to the right, these are the richer nations: Sweden, Germany, Canada, Japan, sort of similar to the United States. And this is the percentage of total income earned by the top 10%. So it's 20 to 30%. The U.S. being on the high side of the richer countries, meaning our income is more concentrated than the other similar economies. On the left, though, these are the poorer nations. You can see South Africa, Brazil, Botswana, 40 to 50%. So the richest 10% of the people are earning 40 to 50% of total income. So it's more concentrated. So again, what kinds of products are we producing in our economy, and why are we producing them? Well, first of all, we're producing products that our consumers want, and we're producing products that have low opportunity costs. So we tend to produce products that need highly skilled workers, people with a lot of human capital, and or capital intensive work, because we have high value capital in our economy. That's our competitive advantage. And the opportunity cost, well, if a worker were to come into, for example, the heavy equipment manufacturing industry, and that's an industry that does very well in the United States, well, that is an industry that, to produce heavy equipment, that's very capital intensive. Each worker has a lot of high value capital to work with to do his or her job. Well, think of the opportunity cost for every worker you attract into that industry. They could be producing, say, furniture or clothing, where you don't need a lot of capital. You would give up, if you were to move someone out of producing heavy equipment into producing furniture, the opportunity cost would be higher than going in the other direction. So this explains why, because we have high value capital and because we have a highly skilled workforce, those are the kinds of jobs that have stayed in the United States. And heavy equipment manufacturing is, as I said, an industry that we do very well in, and we export surplus goods to other countries in that industry. And we've become heavily service-based because of our high-value human capital. And so what are the services industries? We're talking about jobs in financial services. So many of you business graduates are going to end up in those types of careers. Engineering, accounting, healthcare. These are all service industry jobs. How are goods produced and how are services produced in the United States? Well, with our type of economic system, because markets have competition, there is pressure to produce at the lowest possible per unit cost. So this is a low mixture of inputs, relatively speaking, to produce outputs. You're trying to lower the cost of your inputs to produce your outputs. And sometimes that means by producing better technology, production technology to help you produce more with each worker. For whom are the goods and services produced? And I've mentioned this already a few times. Those that are willing and able to pay the market price. The very last topic in this chapter, the last page or two, there's a discussion of worldwide poverty. The average American is not aware how much poverty there is in the world. 3 billion people live on incomes of less than $3 a day. And there's a little less than 8 billion people in the world. So this is close to 3/8 of the world's inhabitants. So this is more than 1/3 are living on incomes of less than $3 a day. 1/6 are illiterate. So that would be 1/2 of those 3 billion. 1/5 of the world's inhabitants are chronically undernourished. The World Bank is an organization that addresses worldwide poverty. All nations want for their living standards to improve. So this would mean their GDP per capita would increase. This can only happen if there's economic growth. A barrier for some poor nations to economic growth is corruption. Remember, we need for the government to provide a legal framework, to have a court of law, to have law enforcement, and for those systems to not be corrupt. If you have those systems but they're corrupt, that is a barrier to economic development, because you have no private property protection, no contract enforcement, without, for example, paying bribes or not being treated fairly in general. Well, no one's going to want to invest in an economy like that. Even those within that economy, even citizens of that nation who have the wealth to do it, would instead leave and invest in, say, the United States, where we don't have as corrupt law enforcement system or courts of law. And so this is chapter 2. So this was a good look at the U.S. economy and comparing ourselves to other economies. And after this, we'll be moving on to chapter 3, the most important chapter in this course. That is the chapter on supply and demand. So I'll see you in chapter 3.